So this CT is going to be on electoral politics and democracy. But first, just wanted to say welcome back. It's sad that Bryn isn't here to see this amazing image of him that exists now. Uh, he's looking really snazzy here. Apparently, this is from yesterday. I wasn't there, but I heard things. Anyway, so I'm going to preface this workshop with a massive disclaimer. And the disclaimer is that I'm a chemistry student. I'm not like a student of political science. Pretty much everything that I'm going to cover in this workshop are things that are either provable in debates or that can happen in debates. So there's not really any wider applicability of this. If something I say is sort of like incorrect and you are somebody who has more knowledge on this, feel free to chime in and correct me. But again, most of this stuff will also be pretty basic. So again, if you're someone who studies politics, a lot of this won't be new to you. For everybody else, you might learn something. Okay. Part one of this workshop is going to be about aims of democratic systems. So electoral systems, starting off, what are they? Electoral systems compose the rules that determine firstly how political representatives are selected, and then also how referenda are carried out. So referenda being direct democracy, and then political representatives being a way that people engage with democracy like by proxy. What then can vary within different systems? Firstly, the frequency of elections, then also who's eligible to vote or obligated to, as is in the case of states where they have mandatory voting and you get fined if you don't vote, who's eligible to run, how ballots are cast and how they're counted. So this could be through like electronic voting machines, this could be paper ballots, campaign spending and funding restrictions, if any. And probably the most relevant thing here is how votes translate to an election outcome. So what is the goal we want to achieve with like democratic systems? Does anyone want to chime in and tell me what they think the goal of electoral systems is? Don't be shy. There's only like 6 of us here. So
Like the best representation of the public or the public's interests in government decisions.
yeah, exactly. So generally speaking, you're trying to get the most functional, let me go back, the most functional and representative aggregation of preferences in order to legitimize the authority of the government. So there's a little bit of an infographic here. This isn't hugely important because usually in debates where you're talking about democratic electoral systems, everybody already agrees that it's important for the government to be like legitimate and representative. So you're probably not going to have to prove this unless somebody's going to contest that democracy is a good thing. Maybe one thing to highlight on this slide is the part where it says functional. So it is impossible for governments to assert the preferences that they've aggregated of the populace if they're not able to do things like enact policy. So even though theoretically we could come up with a political system where like everybody directly votes on laws or policies, this probably just isn't that practical. So there has to be some kind of compromise between functionality and like how representative a government is. And usually we do this through electing like one representative that represents a lot of people that's sort of majoritarian. So how do political systems achieve this? How do they achieve representation? The citizens are firstly informed. So this is through free press, through education, and through discourse that should be also free. And they're also politically engaged. So they have faith in their representatives, they have hope for change, and they have some kind of political mobilization. So they feel like they can do something or enact real change, and they're also empowered. So their vote does lend capacity for real change. Obviously, if there's a political system where everybody voted but their votes like didn't translate to any actions, it wouldn't be representative. So what's important then to flag here is that democracy is an instrumental good. So all of the things before that we said about representation are only good if the government can provide people with like a good standard of living that is in line with their preferences. So if everybody's starving and there's no like economic development or something, democracy is probably something people won't weigh as highly as an important thing. Okay, so then on to the next thing, which is on function versus how representative the government is. This is kind of a sliding scale. So the most representative systems we could conceptualize theoretically would probably be highly impractical, which is why we have an aggregation of preferences through things like political compromise. So things like I'm going to vote for candidate A, because I want policy A, even though this candidate probably also supports policy B, which I don't like as much, but I'm kind of willing to compromise to get a net gain for myself. And then majoritarian decision making. So majoritarian here just meaning that like when the majority of people support something, their preferences are treated as more important than what a small minority of people think would be a better policy. So this is obviously kind of like the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few kind of thing. There's still some stipulations to having a majoritarian system, which are things like you still have to protect fundamental basic rights, usually through your constitution. And then also you have to have some provision of rights for a minority. So like even if the majority of my state is Christian, if there's a big, like, I don't know, Jewish religious minority, it's generally still not okay for us to say that like because one group is the majority, we should discard the preferences of minority groups. So there's like some stipulations to this. Okay, so then systems can be pretty diverse in terms of how they treat this sliding scale. So there's more consensus-based systems that exist where the decision-making structure will prioritize taking into account a broad range of opinions. So this is usually through forming governmental coalitions where like 3 or 4 parties could be in government at one time, or power sharing agreements as well. Other systems have more winners and losers, where if you don't get if you don't end up in government or representative, then none of the policy platform that you had really matters anymore. I'd say that's slightly more similar to the UK system, even though they still have like coalitions. So this is an aspect of electoral systems, but it's also an aspect of the political culture in a given state. So obviously in states where it is the norm to have a lot of coalition governments, it's going to happen more. And in some states, there just isn't a political culture of power sharing, and then it just doesn't happen there, like in the US. Yeah, and then so consensus-based politics can be really important and relevant in state building and conflict resolution. This comes up in debates like all the time, so it's probably something you should learn a bit about. So a couple examples of this: the Northern Ireland Executive is a power sharing agreement executive. It has ministerial portfolios that have to be allocated between parties. So usually this is like Sinn Féin and the DUP, who are both very hardline sectarian parties. And this was instituted after during the Good Friday Agreement as a method of like conflict de-escalation, because obviously when you have two groups that hate each other a lot and one of them has a slight majority, if you have a fully majoritarian system, the other group never gets any policy done that they want. And obviously this can cause more conflict. Another example of this, it's probably a little bit less successful than Northern Ireland, is Lebanon, which is a parliamentary democratic republic that uses confessionalism. So they have a lot of different religious minorities. Well, religious minorities in that like everybody is a religious minority, I guess, except for like one specific like Muslim sect. And how confessionalism works is that they have offices that are proportionately reserved for representatives from certain religious communities. And there's a couple of trans-religious coalitions, but neither of them can govern alone. And that's like codified into law and into their constitution. So then on tyranny of the majority. So talking about some of the flaws maybe with majoritarian representation. So John Stuart Mill argued that majority rule, countries that have majority rule will end up pursuing the political aims of the majority group at the expense of completely disregarding or even sometimes subjugating those who are minorities. This could be like political minorities, or it could be another type of minority like a geographic minority or something like this. And this is analogous to these groups to being ruled by a tyrant, because they basically have no say in anything that happens in politics anymore unless they can like tip the threshold of becoming like a larger group, basically. How do you prevent tyranny of the majority? So often through consensus-based politics, which we already talked about, and also strong constitutional protections of the rights of individuals and of minorities, which we also talked about, and also some decentralization of authority. So this could look like having a federal system where geographic regions still have some level of autonomy. A really good example of this is just the US, where a lot of their states have their own governments. They decide things like state-based tax structures, stuff like that. It is also kind of culturally important for people in the US to have a lot of autonomy on a state level for historical reasons, and then also just because it's a political norm now. Yeah, so examples of this are EU veto powers. So like the EU is an example of like a federal body where there's a lot of decentralized power, and then also state governments in the US. Okay, part 2 of this talk is going to be an overview of some common electoral systems and a rundown of kind of what they look like. So starting off with proportional representation, this is kind of a big umbrella term because it can mean a lot of different things. But what this umbrella composes is systems where the preferences of the electorate, so like political party preference, are reflected proportionately in elected bodies. And this is the most numerically popular electoral system. So the most number of countries use it. So what this practically looks like then is things like partyless proportional representation. So this is where seats are distributed to parties in proportion to the percentage of votes they receive directly by the party. So examples of this being Turkey or Israel, or by individual candidates whose votes are pooled to the greater party. Brazil or Finland are examples of this. And then we also, under this banner, we have STV. So voters can sort candidates in order of preference, and votes are tallied, and candidates not meeting a certain quota of votes are eliminated. With these votes that you've now eliminated, you take them from the bottom of the stack, you move them up to the second preference of the voter. So you keep doing this and iterating it until all available positions can be filled. An example of this is Ireland. A lot of other states are starting to use this now. What are the benefits of proportional representation? Does anybody know off the top of their head what might be some benefits of a system like this? Someone who's not Henrik's, like somebody else.
Well, one benefit can be that it's reasonably immune against gerrymandering.
Yeah, that's one of the benefits. Anybody else have any benefits they think of this system? There's like quite a few, so.
You could say one is as a consequence of it representing the largest number of the population, you get more public buy-in into whatever policies are being enacted by the government. So it's
absolutely.
at least legitimizing it.
Yeah, so when you have less representation by just one political party, because this is a system that's more consensus building, it makes the government seem more legitimate when you have this like broader coalition. So the benefits of this are small parties, especially that have a very decentralized broad support, are more likely to get seats. So like the Greens, something like a Green party is not linked to any geographic location. So if you're operating under an electoral system with constituency ties, it can be hard for them to ever get seats if everything is first past the post, because there'll be very few like constituencies where they have a chance of getting a majority if they're getting like 10% across the board. So then also adding on to this, independent candidates become more viable, independent candidates being those who don't really represent any one political party. And it also reduces the chance of you having a two-party system because smaller parties are more viable. Because again, it's consensus building. And then power is less concentrated purely around large parties. Coalition governments become the norm. Consensus politics. This is also a way you can build a like political culture of consensus politics. And then there's also less safe seats because you can, and which means you can increase voter turnout and engagement in those areas because people aren't saying, well, this is a Tory area anyway, there's no point in me voting or getting involved in politics because I know that which representative is always going to win. Parties are encouraged then to campaign in areas where they are likely to be unpopular because even if they can only get like 20% of the vote, if the alternative is getting like 10%, they're still probably better off under a system like this. And then gerrymandering is also more difficult. I assume we all know what gerrymander, and there's also less tactical voting. That's because of the fact that there is no spoiler effect in a proportional representation system. Just very quickly, I assume we all know what gerrymandering is, but in case anybody doesn't know, it's manipulation of constituency boundaries. So it's when you redraw these boundaries in order to preference one party over the other. You can't do this as much, especially when, well, in a lot of proportional representation systems, you can't do them anyway because there isn't a constituency tie, but it's also hard to do when you can't redraw them unilaterally. And usually because these are consensus building systems where you have coalitions all the time, it's harder to stack the electoral commission who decides these kinds of things with people from just one party. So yeah, and then there's kind of like a little infographic example of what gerrymandering looks like. I assume everybody knows though. Cool. And then here's a picture of a really funny looking congressional district that has been gerrymandered to fuck because it just looks like a line now. So then onto the challenges that exist within proportional representation systems. So radical parties often get more power under these systems because they tend to be smaller, and this is the system that preferences smaller parties. the way that they're able to get more power under these systems is usually by acting as a kingmaker to a larger party in a coalition majority, which can lead to mainstream parties being forced to cater to smaller or more radical parties. So a good example of this is when the DUP and the Tories were in coalition. The Tories were trying to get their Brexit deal passed, so they had to get approval from MPs that were in the DUP, but they just wanted to, they had like a lot of outrageous demands because, again, they're a very radical sectarian party that they wanted met before they were willing to cooperate at all. And they had absolute power because they were the tipping point or the kind of like straw on the camel's back that would allow the Tories to have a majority. You also have large multi-party coalitions being a lot more unstable and elections becoming more frequent. So Italy's kind of infamous for just constantly having elections all of the time because their governments can never agree on anything. And also when they're in the process of building governments, it takes a really long time for them to come to agreement. So they just get a lot less done in general. And when we talked before about democracy being an instrumental good, if you don't have a parliamentary system that is like functional, you can't meaningfully represent any of the preferences of your citizens. The reason I'm just restating this is because sometimes it's important to like know why something's bad because this is your impact in the debate, right? The geographic link between a voter and their representative can be lost. So again, a lot of these, especially like the list party systems, you're just voting for a party that's like kind of faceless. A couple of reasons why this might be bad that I can think of off the top of my head. Probably the first one being that sometimes having a visible representative makes people more politically engaged. And then also secondly, that sometimes people face like specific geographic issues or concerns. If you have a population that's mostly urban, for instance, and you have a small rural population, but they still kind of have to vote for the same few parties that exist, it can be hard for them to get all of the like agricultural policy or something that just caters towards them in a system where like there is no geographic link or they don't have like a specific representative. It's also not a possible method for presidential elections, obviously, because those elections are winner takes all. So you have to do something different if you want a president that is elected by the people and not just picked by a party. Cool. And the reason why that might be important is because sometimes it's important for the head of state to like have more optical like legitimacy. This is just a note quickly on the kingmaker effect, kind of just explaining what it is. It's a term from game theory. You probably all heard it before anyway, but it occurs when two sides in a conflict are evenly matched and there's a third participant in the conflict that can't overpower the other two single-handedly. So if this third power is now the tipping point in the conflict between the other two sides, they become the kingmaker. So they can't win themselves. They can't become a majority or something in this context, but they can ally themselves with one of the other two and decide who wins the conflict by breaking the stalemate. So in this context, again, we're talking about small parties forming coalition governments with larger parties that become king. On this then, on the kingmaker effect, it's pretty value neutral. So we have examples, for instance, here of the DUP being kind of like an example of a radical party that most of us would consider unfavorable or not great in government because they don't usually cooperate a lot. Most of the time they're holding up policy decisions when they're acting as kingmakers. Then you also have some cases where maybe it could be good. So you have like Green Party representatives. These are like the heads of the Scottish Greens who are generally pretty cooperative and usually are just pushing a majority party in a direction that is slightly more progressive and also catering to a political niche that is probably important to represent. So when you're talking about small parties in general, you're probably going to have to frame out one of these two groups to decide if kingmaking is a benefit or a harm in the context of a debate. Okay, the next system we're going to talk about is plurality voting. So this is probably one that most of us are very familiar with. Each elector has one vote. The candidate or candidates with a plurality of the vote are elected. And this is like, again, probably the second most popular system, but it's especially popular in the Anglosphere. Cool. Again, probably because of the British Empire. Functionally, this looks like first past the post, which we all hate, which sucks. Everybody hates it so much. It's the worst system ever. It's used in single member elections as described above. So in the UK elections, you vote for whatever your representative MP in your constituency is going to be. Everybody votes, everybody has one vote. And if 51% vote for a Tory guy and 49% vote for, I don't know, like a Lib Dem guy, all of those Lib Dem people have spoiled their vote. The next type is single non-transferable vote. So this can be used in multi-member elections. So you're voting for like 2 or 3 MPs in one constituency or something like that. And you can cast as many votes as there are positions being filled. So it's effectively the same as first past the post, just in multi-member elections. Instant runoff voting. So this is a form of ranked choice voting for single member elections. But in this case, instead of single transferable vote, where you like start off by like, you still rank candidates, instead of like instead of like in these other types of elections where the person with the plain majority wins or something, or the person with the most votes wins, the most unpopular candidates are removed and you redistribute votes to next preferences until one candidate has an outright majority. So this example of this is Australian elections for Prime Minister. Cool. And then what are the benefits of plurality voting? Does anybody here off the top of their head maybe know some? Because I think from the disadvantages before, you might have some idea. Feel free to chime in.
Well, perhaps as you were saying earlier, people become more politically engaged when they only have one representative that they can like look at.
Mm-hmm. Does anybody else have anything to add to that? I don't want to call on specific people, but there's so. Oh yeah, go ahead, Alicia. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I guess larger parties won't be forced to cooperate with other parties with more extremist views.
Yeah, exactly. That's a good one. Okay, yeah. So you could argue that plurality voting has less like extremism, and it ends up being more with more like centrist parties because people are just trying to cater to everybody. Okay, so benefits of plurality voting: it's uncomplicated for both those tallying votes and for the electorate. So you have like less dual ballots. Some people get very confused by ranked choice voting, which I guess especially if it's a new thing, maybe you can understand why that would be confusing. You're more likely to form strong, stable governments which can implement legislation without contest from disparate coalition parties. This is probably the most important benefit and the one that you should remember if you're trying to do a debate about it. The examples that you use for this, again, are stuff like Italy that just end up having a lot of problems in there and bureaucracy around just trying to form stable governments. And then the second part of that is like the legitimacy attached to having a large majority. So systems like the UK are created to kind of not inflate, but like overrepresent parties that have a slight edge in the polls. So like the Tories getting a huge majority, whereas if they were voting under like the Scottish regional parliament system, they would have like a much smaller, they wouldn't have a majority, and they would also just have a much smaller, is it plurality? I think that's the right term. But because they have this huge majority, it means when they want to enact legislation, people feel that they have the authority to do so. And then you also have less frequent elections as the government is more likely to last a term. There's a couple of reasons why this could be a good thing or a bad thing. So it's under benefits now, but I think there is also probably an argument that frequent elections are a good thing because they mean that people get used to voting and that voting's like a habit, and that it helps engagement if there's more elections. But again, it's probably important to consider context there. Challenges attached to plurality voting. So the most obvious one is tactical voting, and we'll talk about more about that in a second with the spoiler effect, and the seat majorities of large parties being inflated beyond their actual share of the vote. So you could argue this is less reflective of the total population, and you're not fulfilling as much of the representation aspect of a democratic system that you want. It also incentivizes parties to concentrate campaigns on certain geographic areas. So you would know this is like swing states. There's a reason why every politician in the US who wants to be president is going to like the Ohio State Fair. And it's not because they love the state of Ohio. It's because I hear that is a swing state. So they will spend all of their time campaigning and catering towards people in certain regions while possibly neglecting places that are considered safe. Next, you have high density areas often receiving less representation per person per vote. This is kind of a quirk of a lot of constituencies being drawn like based on like land. So often this means that cities that have grown like larger in recent times and rural regions which have stagnated in population or just grown very slightly, it means that things tend to be skewed towards rural people having like more of a say. Next, you have two-party systems end up being a lot more likely. And then also votes that aren't cast for a winning candidate in a given constituency are basically considered wasted votes. So this can lead to a lot of disenfranchisement, especially if you live in a safe seat, because you feel like your vote doesn't matter. And when you feel like your vote doesn't matter, you have no real reason to pay attention to politics or be engaged with politics. Then you also have the gerrymandering is a lot more likely for like all of the inverse reasons that we talked about last. And then lastly, we have the spoiler effect. So the spoiler effect basically means that if you have a large party and you have a smaller party, and the smaller party is similar in ideology from the larger one, even if combined, and if they're very similar, even if combined, they have a total share of the vote that is larger than any other party, they might end up like losing specific elections because their support base is split, which ends up benefiting their opponents. The reason why I've said Andrew Yang a moment is because I've heard apparently he wants to try and make a third party, like other than Republicans and Democrats in the US. But obviously, because he's somebody who's a former Democrat, presumably this nonpartisan party would just mean that the Republicans would win in whatever area that this party would operate. So it's kind of self-defeating. You're not getting any benefit out of it. Obviously, in a proportional system, this would probably be fine and would work out. Alex,
Can I just add something? Yeah.
Go ahead.
So I think maybe another harm is also like sort of ping-ponging that goes on. So the fact that one party can pass a lot of stuff when it's in power isn't necessarily, or doesn't necessarily mean stability insofar as then the other party comes to power and the other party repeals everything that the first one did. And that, of course, causes a lot of instability. But also regarding the proportional voting system and its ability to represent, what's also important is that there's different ways to count to count the way in which the amount of votes that someone got translates into the amount of mandates that they should be given. So an example is that in the Czech Republic, if you're like a party that got a lot of votes, like 30% of the votes, and we have the proportional voting system, you're likely to get like 37% of the seats or something. So it's like skewed to benefit the majority more, which of course the majority parties passed for that exact same reason. So maybe that can be used to sort of like outframe that this is not as important.
Yeah. Especially on that first point, I think this is definitely a harm of two-party systems being a lot more likely under plurality voting. So I don't want to talk about the US all the time, but it does come up in debates a lot, like debates about domestic US politics. So it's probably relevant, is that when you have Republicans and Democrats that are polarized and only a small thing needs to swing the balance to make one be in power and the other one have like no power relatively, it means that they enact legislation and then they repeal it straight away. So it doesn't necessarily, even though they have a strong mandate for that limited time, once it's over, it might as well have not happened, right? Especially for legislation that takes a while to enact or policy plans that like you don't see the effects of for a couple of decades or something like that. Cool. And then lastly, on to mixed electoral system. So this is pretty much exactly what it sounds like. Combines some elements of proportional and plurality voting systems. So this will look like mixed member proportional representation. So the electorate can vote twice. You could vote for your constituency representative, and also you can vote for a list party. So then once you've determined your constituency representatives by something like first past the post, the rest of the seats are allocated to political parties until each party has a number of representatives equivalent to that party's proportion of votes. A good example of this is Scotland. So you might have seen like there were some by-elections like a few months ago, and people talked about list seats and constituency seats. The list seats are the ones that people just voted for the party, and then the constituencies obviously are the ones that are geographically linked. So the Scottish Greens only get list seats because they will only ever get list seats because they have a broad like support base that's not geographically tied to any one particular place. Cool. And then a little tip here. So again, bringing it back to the realm of debating, it can be helpful to treat different electoral systems like competing stakeholders and analyze them separately, or kind of reframe the importance of different ones selectively. So if you say like this debate doesn't matter in proportional representation systems, because secretly you think that those are the cases where you don't win and you want to win in other electoral systems. So for example, in this house would only allow election campaigns to be funded by a fixed budget provided by the state. Obviously, there's going to be different outcomes in a system where you have one or a few large parties that currently dominate. So if you could identify this and explain why you win in each case, this can be a good way of providing clarity. It could also be an extension, or it could also just be like a case that's very difficult to rebut because it has so many prongs to it. So that's a good strategy. And for a lot of domestic politics motions. So we were talking a lot about electoral systems. Motions that you see on this topic won't always be this House prefers X electoral system to X other electoral system. Those motions are actually kind of rare, usually because most people have decided what systems are good and the reasons for it. But it can be good in, again, motions that are about the politics of a specific country that might have some quirks, and then also motions that are just generally about a specific political party doing X, because the incentives of a political party are pretty much always going to be to like maintain their mandate or grow it. And then you can talk about why specific electoral systems will impact that aim in different ways. So part 3 then of this talk is modifications to existing electoral systems, what they are, a bit of a glossary of terms here. Cool. So first we have majority bonus system. So grants additional seats to the majority party for additional government stability. This kind of happens automatically in the last cases that we talked about, or that Alex just mentioned in the Czech Republic. There's systems where they explicitly just do this on purpose. It has all pretty much the same benefits and harms that we already discussed. Then we have primary elections. So if you have a bunch of party candidates, you like decide on those before the election. You're deciding who to run. So there's a couple of reasons why a political party might do this, but it's mostly just as like a popularity test, because polls are now always reliable. You want to make sure that you're fielding a good candidate, and obviously you're not going to run both candidates at once because of the spoiler effect. So a lot of EU parties do this before European Parliament elections. US political parties do it before the presidential election. And then here's some memes about how Bernie can still win. I don't really know why so much of this workshop ended up being US based, but it did. Yeah, okay. Next part, so the Electoral College. This is a method of indirectly electing representatives. So you have electors that go to the Electoral College and they vote on behalf of the electorate. I think the reasons historically why this has been done is because you couldn't get everybody to travel to one centralized location where all the votes were being tallied. But obviously now we can just like send votes to places or have more voting centers. And it's not like you have to like go on donkey to Washington, D.C. to like tell them who the people of Nebraska want to vote for. So it's kind of archaic and most countries don't do it anymore. You have weighted voting. Some electors' votes are weighted more than others. So Hong Kong is an example of this. They have functional constituencies that are like special interests, like businesses that get to elect representatives. So it's kind of can be like a corporatist thing. Every other example I could find of this was just like really like awful and like kind of racist and like or classist or just terrible. Then you also have stuff about the voting age. Most countries this is 16 to 18. There's some arguments for lowering the voting age. Usually in the debate will be like this House would lower the voting age to 16 or 15 or 14. Some arguments could be citizens can be independent in the workforce and pay taxes. They should be afforded representation. Like 16-year-olds do pay tax, they pay VAT, and they can work. Young people are most affected by long-term impacts of current government policy. Could be something like climate change, but also just any other long-term policy like infrastructure development or something. Earlier political engagements increase the likelihood of political engagement lasting to adulthood. So the idea that if you form a habit of voting at a younger age, maybe when you're still in school and you have more free time, you're more likely to continue doing this later on in life. That's good because the more people that vote or the higher the turnout is, the more representative the government is, the more legitimate it is. Some arguments against it could be that these people don't have enough political maturity or knowledge, or that kind of all ages are arbitrary anyways. There's no particular reason why 16 is better than 18. And many people who are politically mature enough to vote theoretically and deserve representation won't be able to vote pretty much no matter what you do, because there's probably like a 13-year-old somewhere who is very politically informed and should be afforded a vote. On this specific topic of voting age, does anybody have anything they want to add in terms of what they think benefits or arguments against it would be? I think this is a pretty common debate.
I just want to point out that it seems like a pretty shallow op.
Yeah, this is not a motion that gets set. It gets set at schools comps. The reason I bring it up is because it could be relevant as a tangent to a debate, but nobody's setting this house would lower the voting age to 16 at a non-schools comp. If that's what you're wondering. Okay, we'll just move on then. So this is a picture of a fresher giving a PM speech in my interpretation. Okay, cool. Moving on, we also have systems that have reserved political positions. So this is usually something like a quota, or it could be like a special council or a special appointed position that only somebody from a certain group could occupy. Example of this is New Zealand having Maori electorate positions. And then India also has seats in parliament that are just reserved for members of scheduled castes and tribes. So these are like ethnic or religious groups as well, the tribe part. And usually this is like a combination of things. You want to like increase engagement in groups that usually have an under engagement in politics. And then also because these groups have like special, like quote unquote special interests, and you want to make them feel represented, it's like more like legitimizing, so to speak. Then we also have referenda. So this is a form of direct democracy. So the electorate are deciding directly on policy. They're not using political representatives as a middleman for this. Some of them can be legally binding, others are not. For instance, the Brexit referendum, which was still implemented, of course. And then sometimes holding a referendum is a legal requirement in certain circumstances. So like if you want to change the constitution, in most countries, you have to have a referendum. And a lot of the time, if you want to join or leave an international organization like the UN, you have to have a referendum. Arguably, this is the purest form of democracy. It is like the most representative, as you're voting on a specific preference that you have, but it's also arguably could be bad in some ways because voters are driven by transient wants. So they don't often have as much like of a long-term idea of the legacy of whatever policy it is. Like a politician who considers their legacy might care about what happens in 10 years. Sometimes they're not sufficiently informed to make decisions on complicated or technical issues. So a lot of people would have argued letting people vote directly on Brexit was a bad idea because largely the EU is like a body, like it's a trade agreement or a multilateral trade agreement that you're in. So the only people who really are sufficiently informed to decide if it's a good thing or not are like economists and like people trained to understand these things. Kind of an argument for technocracy, but hey, we move. And also that people might be swayed by propaganda, strong personalities, intimidation, and expensive advertising campaigns. Obviously, all of this applies to representative democracy to some extent. It's just that arguably on specific issues, people are more susceptible to these things or to being misled. Cool. Moving on. And then the last thing is that referenda grant a lot of legitimacy, though, because you're voting on one specific thing, and there cannot be an argument that like the electorate didn't really want this, or that there isn't a mandate to do X if people have voted specifically on that. Part 4 of this is just going to be some methods of vote tallying. This will be pretty short. So, firstly, we just have paper ballots, so counted by people. You can use optical scanners, so they scan the sheet where you shade in an oval. You might have done an exam like this before, or you can have ballot marking machines, so like punch cards. A couple of issues: it can be imprecise when it's automatically counted. So you might have heard of the hanging chads. This was, I believe, Gore v. Bush, the presidential election, where they had like a punch card system, and where the paper wasn't fully punched off, like where it was hanging, it was called a hanging chad, and they just didn't count the votes. And there were purportedly like thousands of uncounted boxes of hanging chads, which some people think probably swung the election because it was very close. And then also these can be kind of costly when you get people to count them, though you get often a lot of countries will get volunteers to perform this work anyway, but it can still be expensive if you do have to pay people, or it can just take longer if you're not able to employ a lot of people to do it. I don't know, at home, the count is like kind of a big event where they manually count ballots. So it takes a long time and people watch the results come in very slowly. Some of the harms of this may be that it gives a misleading overview of what the election board is looking like, because some constituencies will get their votes counted faster than others. I think also in the election of Evo, or the re-election of Evo Morales, when they claimed it was voter fraud, one of the reasons they said was that the votes were coming in weren't coming, not too many votes were coming in for him at first, and then a lot of them came in at once. This is kind of explainable by the fact that certain constituencies were coming in at a time, but it ended up supporting optically the argument that there was voter fraud. And then there's also the fact that like some of this stuff can be expensive, like scanning equipment. Cool. Electronic voting involves some kind of voting machine. So there's tampering is more likely as there's no physical record of each vote that you can use for accountability. Election audits are more difficult. Voters tend to trust these systems less, and voting machines have been successfully hacked in the past. I would like to flag that if you're trying to rig an election, it isn't necessarily more easy to do it via electronic voting than it is to do it by like paper ballots. Like it's probably like a similar level of like logistics and organization that you have to do to try and do both. One thing that's probably different is that voters always tend to assume electronic voting is easier to commit fraud. So if there's a election where most of the voting is carried out via electronic vote, a lot of people will be more susceptible to an opposition party or something saying that it's fraud, or they're more likely to believe it. Cool. Then on to the original. So this is the end of the workshop. The original scope of this workshop was a little bit bigger, but it ended up getting a bit long. I wanted to cover some things about like illiberal democracy, some authoritarian stuff and populism stuff. I can still cover these in a separate workshop if people want, but Ron did make a workshop on this already. It's about an hour long. It's very good. I'd recommend it either way, even if I do end up making a workshop on these things. But I don't mind taking people's input for that. We are at the end of the workshop now, so if anybody has any comments or questions, now is probably the time to say them.
Will you be uploading the slides somewhere?
Yeah, all the slides are going to be uploaded. I'm also recording the workshop, so both of them will be up. The slides for the first workshop and the recording of it is already on the Facebook group. Cool. Does anybody else have anything they want to add?
I've got a question, to be fair, but it's more regarding debates. There's usually the clash that, like representation proportionally to the size of the group doesn't necessarily translate to implementation of like passing of policies. That's usually like the case for minority parties. Do you have like any tips on how to like break that stalemate that usually develops?
So what is the clash that you're talking about? Like what is one side saying and what is the other side saying?
I think it's usually like to like support some policies that allow minority parties to get, some like scopes of minorities getting more seats in the parliament, and then usually it's like one side says that they're probably gonna get more seats in the parliament, but the other one says it doesn't really matter because they still can't pass anything.
Usually the mechanism that you would use to explain why minority parties can get a say is the kingmaker effect. So what we discussed before. So you say that if they're able to be the tipping point for one party that's bigger than them getting a majority, they can usually extract concessions from that party by threatening to withhold their support for the coalition. So that's the mechanism pretty much always. Obviously that's hard if this debate takes place in somewhere like not Scotland, obviously, because they have a consensus building system anyway, but a country where like one party dominates all the time and they don't need a coalition to exist, it is very difficult to explain why smaller parties will have influence. And at that point, you can probably only point to the fact that parties can act as oppositions in like debates or like on TV or through media. That's probably the only other mechanism you can do. It's kind of tricky to argue it in that case, though. Does anyone else have any other questions?
Yeah, sorry, one more question. So there's often a clash about representation in that if like a parliament is gridlocked, it cannot effectively represent, blah, 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 doesn't aggregate preferences. I was just wondering to what extent is this a legitimate point to make, given that you can argue that actually maybe the preferences of the people on both sides are to have the gridlock to happen because their preferences are so opposed to the other to those of like the people who want the other parties that it's actually in their interest to have a gridlock instead of having the chance of the policies of the other party to be passed.
I think that's probably a decent piece of rebuttal to the initial point. In terms of how you rebuild the case after that, I assume you would just state that nobody votes for the party with the intention of like blocking legislation. People usually vote for parties because of the positive actions that they promise in their manifesto, which are very rarely things like I'm going to like block party B from implementing X thing. So usually that's not the stated preference of the party anyway. That's what I would do to rebuild. I think it's probably what you said was a good piece of rebuttal to the initial claim, though. But I think this is also it's probably important to know the context of the like debate that this clash exists in to come up with better rebuttal beyond that. Cool. Does anybody else have any more questions? These are really good questions, by the way. Okay, if nobody has any more questions, if you do come up with any more, I'm sure you can send them to me via Facebook or something. Thank you for listening to my presentation. This is a picture of Borat. I was going to try and do a Borat impression, but I actually can't really do it. So if anybody here can do a Borat
Please
impression.
do so. Please do. Please
Henrik,
do.
you can give it a go. Try and say this in the Borat voice. Go.
Thank you for listening to my presentation.
That was great.